about IVF. I'm the father.
You don't hear that every day.
I'm the father of IVF.
We should take responsibility for the fact that 1 in 3 women in America lives in a Trump abortion ban state.
Every single time there's a serious measure in the House to secure the border, Colin Allred votes no.
You can't be for the mob on January 6th and for the officers. You can't. And it's not funny, because you're a threat to democracy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. The presidential candidates, to no one's surprise, are attempting to reach as many voters as they can now with less than 3 weeks before Election Day. Former President Trump appeared in 2 televised town halls. On Fox News, he largely focused on immigration and the border. Trump also taped a town hall with the Spanish-language network Univision in Miami. The former president holds what pollsters project to be a commanding lead among Florida's Hispanic voters. And he spoke to those who may still be undecided. Vice President Harris is hoping to win over Republicans on the fence still about whether or not to support Trump. Today, she held a rally in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a little bit north of Philadelphia, where she highlighted Republicans now supporting her and also sat down for an interview with Fox News. Robert Costa joins us now from Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania. That is, if I have the geography correct, in Bucks County, which that's where you grow up, Robert. So tell me, what's it like, A, to be home? What's the mood there, and what have you heard?
Well, Major, great to be with you. It's, of course, not about me, but I did grow up here. I know Bucks County. It's suburban Philadelphia. It's traditional Republicans. I'm walking around. I'm seeing former Congressman Jim Greenwood, a moderate Republican from years ago in the House of Representatives. Former Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois is here. Former Congressman Denver Riggleman of Virginia. They're all coming here. Even Christine Todd Whitman from across the Delaware River right behind me, the former New Jersey governor. Centrist Republicans. Vice President Harris remarked on stage today that she would be pretty surprised in any other election year to have this group show up on stage with her in the closing lap of a presidential campaign. But here they are. The Harris campaign truly believes, based on my conversations with top advisors, that she can make inroads with traditional Republicans who don't like former President Trump's conduct, his character. Now, a lot of these Republicans don't mind his economic policies, maybe not his protectionist view on trade, but they like low taxes. This is a prosperous area in many respects. It also has a manufacturing and working class base in other parts of Bucks County. It's a real sliver of Pennsylvania and the country.
Bob, I want you to stand by just for a moment. I want to bring in Nicole Killian, who is hurriedly joined us from Georgia. And I know it's been a bit of an issue to get you there in time. Nicole, we're very appreciative that you're here. Catch us up on where you are and what you have been covering today.
Well, obviously, there are quite a few developments here in Georgia. We're obviously outside of a polling location now as Georgia begins with its second day of early voting. But we already saw on that first day the state has shattered records with well over 300,000 votes cast. And so far today, more than 100,000 votes have been cast. So the pace is continuing in terms of people trying to make their voices heard. But in addition to that, of course, the former president was just here in Georgia last night at a rally just outside of Atlanta. But he also did a town hall that was centered around women's issues, more specifically where he addressed an all-female audience. And while he was trying to make inroads with women, he is getting some pushback for comments that he made during that town hall where he said that I am the father of IVF. Take a listen.
And IVF, you had mentioned before
Right,
IVF.
let's get this question, because I believe that's what this is about.
Oh, I want to talk about IVF. I'm the father.
You don't hear that every day.
I'm the father of IVF, so I want to hear this question.
I found it to be quite bizarre. Actually, he called himself the father of IVF. And if what he meant is taking responsibility, well, then, yeah, he should take responsibility for the fact that 1 in 3 women in America lives in a Trump abortion ban state. So, of course, that was a vice president there reacting to those comments. Obviously, she has been someone that's been very stalwart and really hitting home the message with respect to reproductive rights. So that's why you heard her taking aim at the former president for his comments there. But for his part, the Trump campaign telling us that the former president was simply trying to reaffirm his support for those fertility treatments and that he was simply making the comments in jest. Major?
Robert, I want to go back to you because there has been emphasis the Harris campaign in western Pennsylvania. You know the geography of the state very well. But not only in Philadelphia County, but the other surrounding counties, Bucks County, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery County, they comprise and will comprise on election night a substantial part of the Pennsylvania vote writ large. What's the state of the campaign there based on your reporting as best you can tell?
There's a real sense inside the Harris campaign that in western Pennsylvania, in exurban and rural areas, the Trump campaign, as it did in 2016 and 2020, is going to do pretty well. And they can't always predict the amount of turnout of those Trump supporters who might not be politically active in any other context except when Trump is on the ballot. So they really do need to make inroads, top Democrats tell me, among suburban Republicans, among centrists, to make sure that if there is any unexpected low turnout in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, in those urban areas where the Democrats have a lot of historically significant support among labor unions, among voters of color, among other workers in those cities. If those numbers are not at the levels they need to be, that means they need to do well in the suburbs. That's why you see her taking the time to come to Bucks County. It's a place that was won by President Biden. It was won in the past by President Clinton. It's also a place that George W. Bush did well. And so she needs to try to get those January 6 wary Republicans to come along.
And Nicole, I want to go back to you because in Georgia, you're in Atlanta, if I understand that correctly. Not only Fulton County, but the surrounding suburban counties crucial there as well. Any sense of where things stand in those counties?
Yeah, well, I think I would point out, you were asking me earlier what all is happening in Georgia, and I think it's worth mentioning a couple of things just on the legal front, simply because we have seen a number of rulings by the Fulton County Court, and even just late this afternoon, District Attorney Fani Willis filed to get the charges against former President Trump restated in the 2020 election interference case. You may recall earlier this spring, a series of charges, about 6 charges were thrown out against the former president and 5 of his co-defendants. They were solicitation charges related to that false elector scheme as part of the alleged election interference case. And so she is now pushing to get those reinstated. And then in addition to that, you also have some rulings that impact how ballots will be addressed and how election night will be handled here in Georgia. And those pair of rulings coming from Judge Robert McBurney over the last 24 to 48 hours, where late yesterday he blocked a ruling, or blocked a new rule, I should say, that was implemented just a month ago by a controversial state election board that would have required ballots to be hand counted on election night. And he said that's just too much and too late in the process to try to implement. Separate from that, he also issued a separate ruling requiring that local officials and jurisdictions certify their election results on time. Again, all of these efforts aimed at trying to make sure that there is no doubt sowed in the election outcome here in Georgia, particularly in light of what happened here in 2020.
Nicole Killian in Atlanta, Robert Costa in suburban Philadelphia. Thank you both very much. As Nicole just mentioned, a significant court ruling blocking a mandate on how some ballots are to be counted in Georgia. What that ruling could mean for the vote count in that battleground state. That's coming up next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Early in-person voting is underway in Georgia. A judge there last night blocked a new rule that would have required the hand counting of election ballots. We'll get into more of that in just a second. The judge called this rule, quote, too much, too late. Nicole Killian referred to this just a moment ago and said he feared it would diminish public confidence in the reporting of 2024 election results. The Georgia State Election Board passed this hand counting requirement less than 1 month ago. David Becker joins me now to talk about Georgia and other election-related issues. He is an election law expert, political contributor, and executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. He is also, I am proud to say, my co-author of this book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. David, great to see you. Let's talk about Georgia. Early voting, more than 500,000 early in-person votes already cast. And these 2 significant decisions, break them down for us.
Well, first of all, with regard to early voting, Georgia just started yesterday. Its first day of early voting, over 300,000 people cast a ballot, blowing away their previous record, more than twice their previous record. Now the second highest amount of early voting is today, and the day isn't even over yet. Over 500,000 people have voted safely, conveniently, no reports of any problems or even long lines.
All good signs.
And that represents over 10% of the total number of votes that were cast in 2020. So we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm in Georgia. I think it's enthusiasm all over the state in redder areas and bluer areas, but that's a really good sign for democracy.
And Georgia officials, most of them Republicans, say this is an answer to all the criticism heaped on Georgia after it slightly changed its election laws post-2020.
Georgia's been an epicenter for kind of the partisan warfare over election policies, but I can tell you I've worked in Georgia for a very long time. I used to oversee Georgia when I was at the Department of Justice doing voting rights work. And right now, Georgia is one of the states that runs elections about as well as anybody else in the country. It has one of the highest voter registration rates in the country. It's easy to vote by mail if you want to. It's, as they're showing right now, it's very easy to vote early in person. And there's widespread election day voting. They have paper ballots throughout the state. It's a very well-run state with regard to voting.
Two decisions. One, that counties must certify by November 12th, and there will not be a requirement to hand count the number of ballots on Election Day.
That's right.
Why do they matter?
They matter because these were efforts to kind of destabilize the process that was already working very well. With regard to the certification issue, in every state, certification is non-discretionary. It's mandatory. Even the lawyers for the state board who tried to pass this rule, trying to weaken some of the guardrails, admitted that they have to, the counties have to certify their results by November 12th at 5 p.m., which was the state deadline in Georgia. So this is a widely expected ruling, but it's good to establish clear standards there. With regard to this hand count rule that the board tried to put in place, as you put it, too much too late, as the judge put it, it was really a very significant rule. It was going to require poll workers who worked very long days to count large numbers of paper ballots late at night when they were exhausted. And it was likely those numbers were not going to match, and that was going to fuel disinformation. Also, just training those people to do this thing that had never been done before in Georgia was going to be really hard. And the judge correctly, I think, said, you can't do this so close to the election. All the election officials, all the state executives, Secretary Raffensperger and others said this was unnecessary. It could lead to problems. It didn't need to be done.
And just to reiterate a point we make in our book, when you have paper ballots run through machines, you have a means by which to double-check the numbers and voter intent.
Georgia audits the ballots, as does every place in the United States with paper ballots. 95% of all people vote on paper ballots in the United States, including all the voters in all the battleground states. Georgia famously hand-counted all of their presidential ballots entirely by hand to confirm the results, and they were confirmed. Republicans
have filed lawsuits in 3 swing states about overseas voting. What is the import of those lawsuits? What is the issue at hand?
Well, I think it's really disappointing to see these late lawsuits that attack not just overseas voting, but importantly, military voting. There are laws in place that Congress has passed going way back to 1986 that established some procedures that allow it to be easier for members of the military to cast a ballot. It's very difficult for them. It's often hard for them to get a ballot in time, to take time to be able to vote their ballot and then return it so it arrives in time to be counted. And so Congress, in its wisdom, on a bipartisan basis in 1986 and then amending it in 2009, passed laws that allowed for this. These laws have been on the books for a very long time. And especially in Pennsylvania, we have Republican members of Congress, members of the current House majority, who know about this law, who in fact are part of the body that has the sole authority to change this law, coming to a court just days before a major federal election and asking for a court to do what they apparently didn't want to do or didn't think to do well in advance for a law that's been in place for nearly 40 decades. And if they get the relief they seek, and I don't think they will, it could really place barriers in the place of military voters, and I think that should really concern all of us.
David Becker, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. As misinformation about election issues spread, officials in Wisconsin, well, they're getting a bit creative in attempting to reassure voters that elections there are secure. Dane County officials are using a Star Wars parody to get their message across. In a video, a character named Chad Vader tries to seize control of a polling place, but a clerk is on hand to explain why voters have nothing to fear on Election Day. Here's just a bit of that public information video.
The security of this election station has been compromised. It is under the control of the Rebel Alliance. Search your feelings. You know this to be true.
Actually, Chad, elections are run at the local level by thousands of volunteers, like us.
Yeah, poll workers and clerks from both political parties test this equipment, make sure it's working properly.
You don't need to rely on feelings when you got the facts.
Facts over feelings. Dane County Clerk Scott McDonnell has said that using humor helps them get across information to more people, and their mission is, he says, to cut through the noise. Beyond the polls, what voter registration data could tell us about election turnout overall, and which groups seem to be more motivated to get out the vote? That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for hanging out with me. The deadline to register to vote in presidential elections, well, it's already passed in more than a dozen states. Here's what we know. Millions of newly registered voters are going to participate in all likelihood at this election. Data firm TargetSmart has tallied more than 17.8 million voter registrations since the 2022 midterm elections. Nearly half of these registrants are Democrats, about a third Republicans. Nearly 17% list themselves as unaffiliated. Tom Bonier joins us now. Tom is a senior advisor at that political data organization, TargetSmart. And as I've said before, Tom is a Democrat. Anyone can figure that out. But the data are the data. And that's what we want to dig into. And I also want to let everyone know, the things we're going to be talking about are not predictive. They are pieces of evidence that may lead us to understand things on Election Day better. But they are not in any way conclusive. But what does registration data tell you, not only since 2022, but since Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee? Is there anything worth focusing on there?
Yeah. I mean, the reason that data is so important, as you say, it's not going to tell us who's going to win, but the polls are telling us that the race is very close. I don't expect to see anything between now and Election Day that will change that. It's going to be a close election. So the question is, who's going to come out? Where is the intensity? Where is the enthusiasm? The polls aren't always very good at capturing that element. And so voter registration data has historically been a pretty good predictor of which groups are surging in intensity. And so, you know, as you showed there, there's a Democratic advantage. Most of that, if not entirely, has come after July 21st when Vice President Harris became the nominee. Frankly, before that, Democratic registration didn't look that great. Republicans were out registering Democrats. You really saw a switch flipped at that point, and you've seen Democrats have a pretty significant advantage over that time period.
Let's talk about early vote. We're starting to get some early voting in. There are inferences, ladies and gentlemen, that can be drawn from that, but that's all you can do, draw inferences. And people who are professionals in this look at early voting data basically to say who's still out there to be persuaded, and that's about all the conclusions they draw. But are there things that you see in early voting data, for example, in Michigan that might be interesting or potentially relevant?
Well, I've spent a lot of time looking at Michigan for obvious reasons. And again, same with the voter registration. It's a question of where there's intensity and enthusiasm. Because again, polls will tell us how people are going to vote, but not who's going to vote. So the early vote is sort of the other part of that equation, where, as you say, your caution is very warranted. It's not going to tell us who's going to win, but it's good breadcrumbs. In Michigan, what's remarkable to me is the very high turnout in the early vote data among black voters. We're comparing this to the turnout 4 years prior, and what we're seeing is an actual increase of a few points in the share of early voters who are black voters. It's coming primarily out of Wayne County and Detroit. Remember, President Trump made some disparaging comments last week, so it was sort of timed, probably from the perspective of the Harris campaign, almost perfectly. It's overwhelmingly older black women who are turning out there at much higher rates than we've seen before.
Anything to note in Pennsylvania via the early vote? Pennsylvania
is interesting to me sort of for the opposite reason. We know that Democrats have dominated the vote by mail. They did that in 2020, where they won by almost a 3-to-1 margin, the mail votes. That used to be a big Republican advantage. Donald Trump really convinced his supporters in 2020 that it was a fraudulent way of voting.
Which it isn't.
It is not, to be clear. Republicans have done a lot of work trying to clean that up since then, including Donald Trump himself is now encouraging his supporters. So you've actually seen an increase where there were 16% of the mail vote at this point 4 years ago. They're up to 24%. So it's an increase, but it's also not quite where they would want it to be at this point, I imagine.
Anything interesting in Georgia? We were just talking with David Becker about 2 historic days of early voting in person in Georgia.
Yeah, just massive turnout. I mean, number one, if we had a question about whether or not voters are highly engaged in this election,
and enthused, answer so far in Georgia, absolutely.
Yeah, very high turnout. And so In terms of the actual demographics, what we know that Georgia is a very diverse state. For Democrats to win there, they need high turnout from voters of color. We look at the share of the electorate that is white as generally an indicator of where things are going. What we've seen when we compare the early vote so far to where it was 4 years ago at this time, you're seeing the white share drop by about 1.5 points. So you're seeing more intensity and enthusiasm from voters of color so far. Very early, as you said, this is just the end of the second day. A lot more data to come, but probably some signs that the Harris campaign is at least cautiously optimistic about at this moment.
Tom Bonnier called them breadcrumbs. I would say very tasty indeed. Tom Bonnier, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Vice President Harris campaigning is spending time in the Rust Belt this week. How her campaign could be banking on the so-called blue wall to help deliver her to the White House. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. So back in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost the so-called blue wall. Remember, it's not a blue wall, it's a construction. Constructed by Ron Brownstein, a good friend of mine. Go to the Atlantic, put it in the Google, you'll find it. Blue wall, Ron Brownstein. Anyway, it was a way of thinking about the electoral map for Democrats. Hillary Clinton failed to carry some key states in that supposed blue wall in 2016. Well, here's why all that matters. 20 days before Election Day, Vice President Harris not taking 3 of those important so-called blue wall states for granted. This week alone, she's holding events in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Again, under the Brownsteinian rule, they're part of the supposed blue wall. I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe from Milwaukee. Ed, summarize some of the things you've seen on the campaign trail as the vice president heads to Wisconsin later this evening.
Major, good to be with you. The fact that she's focused on these 3 states is an acknowledgement by her campaign. They understand the importance of them. They really serve as the cornerstone of her path to 270, or at least the easiest way to get there, most reliable way. Remember, Trump won these ones in 2016. Biden won them narrowly in 2020. She'd like to win all or most of them and really needs to if things are going to go soft in the Sun Belt. So you've seen a focus on black voters in the Detroit area in Michigan. You saw today the outreach to Republicans, especially in suburban Philadelphia. Coming here to Wisconsin tomorrow for 3 events. Expect a focus on the economy, which of course is issue number 1 in this state and so many others. But we wanted to also acknowledge, Major, something that her campaign was doing down in South Florida today ahead of former President Trump's Univision town hall tonight. They did something we've not seen before done by any campaign. And they brought out children who were separated from their parents during the Trump administration's immigration push to speak about those experiences. This is designed to draw attention, especially among Latino voters, Spanish-speaking voters, to remind them, should they be interested in the former president, of his legacy. It's worth watching these children who are now between the ages of 12 and 16, but so many years ago, of course, would have been quite young. Take a look.
And then told us that we're going to be separated, and then we started to cry.
The emptiness that I felt when they told me that I wasn't going to be able to see my family again was something out of this world, and something that no kid should go through.
I asked them plenty of times when I was going to see my mom again, and they told me I was going to see her soon, but it never happened.
These children have since been reunited with their families, and all of their parents were in attendance at that press conference in South Florida, Major. But a good example of how, while she's here in the Midwest, in the Ron Brownstein constructed blue wall, focused on winning these big battlegrounds, her campaign is also at the same time trying to tell another group of voters, don't think about voting for Trump. Let us remind you of what happened in the past. And as aides pointed out to me today, he has not ruled out implementing the family separation program again should he get elected president.
And Ed, very quickly, it seems also that part of that messaging is the rhetoric from former President Trump. This campaign has been harsher than it was before he became president in 2016. And if you are upset about family separation then, you might have even more to be upset about if he's sent back to the White House.
Precisely. And it's on this issue in immigration, which is of concern to people in Florida and other states, whether it's the issue of IVF and whether he's the father of IVF or whatever. Every day they've got examples of this. And this was one stark, pretty personal way to highlight some of that rhetoric and a reminder of what could come should he win the White House.
In downtown Milwaukee for us, Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much. I want to bring in our political panel, Leslie Sanchez, and Chaim Moore. Leslie, is a CBS News political analyst. Just get that out of my throat. And Republican strategist. Jaime is with Cornerstone Public Affairs, formerly worked at the DNC. Jaime, I want to start with you. Not only is this on immigration about what the Harris campaign is saying, well, we had a good bill, Trump killed it. This is a different way of approaching it. Why does it matter?
I mean, you brought up Hillary Clinton a little while ago. Think about this. Hillary Clinton would have never done this in 2016. So Kamala Harris is running a more risky campaign in some ways. And so what she's realizing is, in order to get the message out, in order for people like us to talk about it, she's got to be a little more creative. And so one is drawing attention to the policy, but two, it's just being a little bit more creative in the approach.
Leslie,
I'm still stunned. I'm still stunned by the approach. I mean, creative, sure. Let's politicize young children. Let's put them up there.
Do you think it's exploiting them?
Absolutely. I don't think there's
anybody... You don't
anybody...
think they suffered?
That question isn't whether or not they suffer. Does it dehumanize them? Does it put them in a position where they're a political pawn? Does it take away, now I'm talking about that part of the story, how offensive it is, as opposed to what the issue is? And are we at that desperate stage? We can make as many criticisms as people want about the deportation policies or mass deportation that Trump's talking about, but to use children on a stage like that just reeks of desperation. And fundamentally, if we think about the fact, so many of these children that come across, they're trafficked, which is a hard word to say. They're sexually abused. They're disconnected, and they don't have a voice. And now when you give them a voice, you put them on a platform for a political campaign. I just think fundamentally it's so wrong.
Do you think it's more dehumanizing to be separated from your parent or standing in front of a podium?
I think it's ridiculous to make that comparison. Those children were used as political pawns for a very desperate campaign 20 days out from a presidential. I mean, we need to stop and take a minute. That never should have happened anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Major, look at this. J.D. Vance, the guy who's running for vice president, said that he and Donald Trump made up the cats and dogs sort of theory in Ohio because they wanted to draw attention. And so, look, I think both campaigns were doing some things that could be unsavory, but this is a very serious issue to vice president.
Does this strike you as unsavory?
No, I don't. It doesn't to me. And I think this is a very serious issue. She has been an AG of a border state. She understands this issue very, very, very well. I mean, she's prosecuted some of these people who've trafficked people across the country. And so I think that she's taking this seriously, but she recognizes in this campaign era, she's got to be very direct in what she communicates it. And I think this was a good tactic for that.
I think just a counter to that is people are going to say, as the borders are, whether she was labeled that or not, she fundamentally failed in that role. And you've seen, you know, people can argue about the record of the Biden-Harris administration, but that's where the criticism's going to land.
So Trump said today he's father of IVF. Is he, Leslie? You want to take that brief on?
No. I'll go with Peter. I'll go with Peter Thiel that says take him seriously, but not literally. I think the bigger point and the message on that is that overwhelmingly this country supports access to IVF treatments, and Republicans need to support that as well.
Right, but just to remind everyone, it became an issue in Alabama after Dobbs, after questions were raised about access to reproductive health care, abortion access, flow downstream to in vitro fertilization.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think I respect Leslie very much so, and Peter was right in some ways, but I think we've got to stop taking Donald Trump for what he said, for what he means, but what he says. I mean, he said that he wanted to ban abortion. He appointed 3 justices that allowed for that to happen in 22 states now in America. And so I think in order to question where he stands on some of these issues like IVF, I don't think that's unfair to say. If he says that he's for IVF, I guess we can believe him this go around. Maybe Ivanka got in his ear about it. But he's been very clear about where he stands on abortion for the last 8-9 years. Maybe he flip-flopped, once he became the candidate for president in 2016. But he's been very clear. He believes that we should try to limit abortion as much as possible. I don't think anyone wants to have an abortion, but I think women want to have a choice about their own bodies. They want to be able to choose if they go to the doctor or not. And what that process, particularly when they're having children, I'm not a woman, but particularly when they're having children, that's a very personal decision.
Leslie, 100 Republicans were with Vice President Harris in Bucks County, Pennsylvania today. Matter or not?
No.
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 Flat no. Makes no difference.
No. It's like a lot of people, leaving in disagreement or protest from a party and then crying because nobody realized they were gone. I mean, for many people that have made up their minds, and we're talking about the small sliver that's in the middle, they fundamentally either don't know them, don't recognize them, or don't care. It's a very harsh reality, but when you're out there speaking to folks, I think we've even talked about this, we agree, because it's their own individual pocketbook and what they see as a solution. The candidate that can articulate that best is the candidate that will
So,
win.
Jaime, you agree 100 Republicans with Harris doesn't matter in Bucks County?
I don't think it matters very much. I think the margins maybe in some other states, but in Bucks County, I think this was because we're talking about it today. We're covering it, and it allowed for the media to have this conversation, but I'm not sure that it matters on the margins.
Very quickly, Elon Musk gives Trump $75 million, a Trump super PAC. Elon Musk in politics, good or bad?
I think it's about freedom. I mean, that's his mantra, right? It's his freedom of speech, freedom to donate, freedom to have access, and for Peter.
Does that scare you?
No, it doesn't scare me. I mean, I think it's very clear. It shows who Donald Trump is. You know, who his
you don't mind
friends
the
are.
association.
Look, I would love a little bit more money on the Democratic side, but if he chooses that, she did raise $1 billion in the last couple of months. But if he chooses to do that, I mean, that's fine. That's his choice, and I think he's been clear about the Donald Trump.
I would like to drop that. You raised $1 billion.
Yeah.
Leslie Sanchez, I'm more. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Israel is launching new strikes in Beirut despite warnings from the United States. Israeli military said it hit an underground Hezbollah weapons cache overnight. The Biden administration has expressed concerns, putting it mildly, about Israel's growing number of military strikes on Lebanon's capital. U.S. officials have also, this is important, sent Israel a letter warning it may cut off weapons if the country does not allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israeli officials must comply within 30 days. So says the letter. The White House says this letter, quote, was not meant as a threat. She gained former President Trump's praise for her recent debate performance. Will it be enough for Republican Kari Lake as she tries to defeat Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego in Arizona's Senate race? That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego and Republican Kari Lake are battling for a pretty significant Senate seat in Arizona. Early voting is underway there. Elizabeth Campbell and Chris Van Cleve join us now from Apache Junction, Arizona. Great to see you both. Chris, you talked to Kari Lake today. What you have to say?
Well, she was starting her Get Out the Vote bus tour today, and she's been encouraging her voters to vote early, which is a bit of a notable change from when she was running for governor 2 years ago, when she talked about perhaps the need to limit mail-in and early voting. She talked about wanting to have an election day, not an election season. This time the message has changed, which is get out the vote early. That perhaps is a lesson learned from 2022. She feels very confident. If you look at most of the polls, they show her behind. She says she doesn't buy that. She believes her internal polling that says she's ahead, and that she, in her mind, she says she's listening to Arizona voters like the folks who assembled around her today. Take a listen.
We're just really encouraging voters to show up at some of the voting sites, and then I'm going to show up with them and have a chance to talk with them, because as you can see, we have the greatest people here in Arizona. And so we're doing a lot of this everywhere I go. I was in Mesa last night, my last stop of the day, and we were talking about getting out the vote, the importance of getting that ballot turned in.
You know, and her message is secure the border. Hitting Democrats on inflation, the fact that it's gotten much more expensive to live in Arizona, to buy a home in Arizona. And she's trying to paint her opponent as an extremist, not somebody who is down the middle or moderate, as some of the ads, she says, might portray him, but in reality, a far more progressive candidate than perhaps she thinks her voters would support.
Elizabeth, I want to talk to you about an adventure you had on Monday to the Grand Canyon. Why did you go there, and what did you find?
Well, indeed, we went on about an 8-mile hike with candidate Gallego. He was there to try to turn out the vote, which is the game pretty much every politician is playing this late in the game. He was specifically targeting the 22 Indian tribes that they have here in Arizona, and he was hiking to the Havasupai tribe to try to turn out the 150 voters he had there. Take a listen to what he told me about why it was important to be there.
While it's important, obviously, to listen to them when they come visit you in D.C. or in Phoenix, it's also important for you to go to their land so they could actually see what they're talking about when they tell you that, you know, water is important, the challenges they have. You know, if you actually physically can see it, I think it actually makes you a better, representative of them.
And we had lots of time to chat on that very long hike down the canyon. He said his main goal now is to invite as many voters as he can, this wide tent, to cross over and come vote for him, the Democratic Party.
Chris, I want to start with you, then have Elizabeth answer the same question. So the data coming out of Arizona shows Harris, Trump, close, but Trump slightly leading, and Lake a bit farther behind Gallego. What is the sense campaigns have about what appears to be kind of a disconnect there?
Well, certainly you have the Lake campaign, which is rejecting any poll they haven't done. But when you look
That's
at
harmful,
the
though.
polls,
That can be harmful to your political health.
Fundamentally, I asked her, in fact, today, if you believe the polls, you're the underdog here, which is in some ways hard to believe because Kari Lake is probably the better known in Arizona of the two. She was one of the top news anchors in the Phoenix market for decades. So everybody knows Kari Lake. Of course, she ran for governor here. So one of the challenges may be that there's already a lot of baked-in thoughts. You like Kari Lake, you don't like Kari Lake, but you certainly know who she is, whereas you have her opponent is somebody who, while well-known in Arizona, may not be known by everybody in the way that Lake was, where she was in people's living rooms for decades.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I think we were talking as well. Yeah, that Ruben Gallego, he's really trying to do the person-to-person politics. His whole plan is to get out there to meet the voters. He's going all across the state. And his thinking is that that is what's going to help him maintain this lead in kind of all of the polling we've been seeing recently. He did say he trusted some of the polling, not just from his campaign, but of course he's leading in all those polls, so that probably helps him out. His plan is just to kind of keep doing that. He's really targeting minority voters, like we talked about this adventure down to that tribe in the Grand Canyon. He's also done a lot of votes targeting Latino voters. I asked him about how Harris could potentially do the same on the ticket, and he says that person-to-person connection is really what he's going to focus on and keep doing in these last few days.
Our thanks to Elizabeth Campbell and Chris Van Cleve. We appreciate it.
Colin Allred is going to try to say an awful lot of words that sound reasonable. But what he's not going to talk about is his own record or my record.
I'm the exact opposite of Senator Cruz, who's the most extreme senator in the United States Senate, maybe the most extreme in the last 30 years.
A tense and lively Texas showdown as Senator Ted Cruz and Congressman Colin Allred spar heatedly in their Senate race debate. What the candidates had to say, that's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Here's a question stirring up Texas politics. Can Democratic Congressman Colin Allred defeat Senator Ted Cruz, the Republican who's seeking a third term? Last night, the two candidates had their one and only debate, and several moments, well, they got a bit heated, including this exchange over January 6th.
Congressman Allred is happy to talk about those who committed acts of violence on January 6th, but you don't hear him talking about the Antifa and Black Lives Matter riots that burned cities across this country.
I took off my suit jacket, and I was prepared to defend the House floor from the mob. At the same time, after he'd gone around the country lying about the election, after he'd been the architect of the attempt to overthrow that election, when that mob came, Senator Cruz was hiding in a supply closet.
Gromer Jeffers is a political writer for the Dallas Morning News and was one of the moderators at last night's debate. Gromer, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Your takeaways from last night's debate.
They went at it pretty fierce, as you saw in that clip. You know, Colin Allred, he's a congressman, first elected in 2018, flipped a Dallas area congressional seat from Republican Pete Sessions. And he's the latest great hope for Democrats to try to win a statewide race in Texas since 1994. And the way to do that, he feels like, is to go at Ted Cruz head on. Now, Ted Cruz is known as a great debater. And so Allred's mission was to go in there, make the contrast, but to be tough and project that it's time to send Ted Cruz home. And he wanted to do that by appealing to independents and Republicans who are predisposed to maybe vote against Cruz. Maybe they're Republicans, maybe they don't like Cruz. And that was his job last night, was to try to appeal to those voters.
Another spicy moment in the debate, Congressman Allred brought up Senator Cruz's trip to Cancun during the 2021 energy crisis in Texas. Let's listen to that.
But you're not actually there when people need you, like when the lights went out. When 30 million Texans were relying on a senator to spring into action, he went to Cancun. That's who he is. If you give me the chance to be your United States Senator, I'll never abandon you.
Gromer, as you accurately said, Colin Allred is the latest of, so far, unrealized Democratic hopes. Lots of money behind it, lots of aspirations, never realized since 1994 to win statewide. What's the state of the race, and what effect, if any, do you think last night's debate may have?
It's a single-digit race. One of the latest polls show it a 4-point race. Some polls have had it as close as 1 point. So it's a close race. Beto O'Rourke in 2018 came within 2.6 percentage points of beating Cruz. That's pretty tight. And so a single-digit race is what we expected. The question is, if it's four points now, what has to happen for Colin Allred to get over the hill? Will it be a Kamala Harris surge here in Texas in the urban areas, in the Democratic strongholds, a surge that will be able to help them to overcome Cruz's advantage in the small towns and rural areas? And of course, there's the battle for the suburbs, and Allred is trying to use the issue of reproductive rights. Texas has one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country, and he's trying to use that to sort of rally women behind him, particularly suburban women. We'll just have to see what happens because, as you pointed out, Major, it's been a long time since a Democrat has won a statewide race here. There's been different formulas as to how to do that. But at the end of the day, there are more Republicans in the electorate than Democrats. And so it's tough for a Democrat to have to rally that base, but also get persuadable voters.
And that mathematics is more complex in a presidential election year when all evidence suggests there'll be higher Republican turnout. What is the Ted Cruz argument for a third term?
His argument is that he has done some work in the Senate, that he's done work in pushing conservative legislation. His main argument is a keep Texas argument, keep Texas conservative. And that if you turn him out of office in favor of Colin Allred, Texas won't be Texas anymore. That's the argument he's pushing. And he's been hitting Allred hard with ads about transgender participation in women's sports and culture war issues like that. So it's an argument that Allred is too liberal for Texas. It worked in 2018 against Beto O'Rourke, and he's hoping that it'll work again this time.
Gromer Jeffers of the Dallas Morning News, thank you so much for your time, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Major Garrett.
Embattled New York City Mayor Eric Adams may have reached his final strike with at least some New York constituents. It's kind of a fashion faux pas that some New Yorkers, well, they might take as seriously as, well, those felony indictments alleging corruption that Adams is fighting. Adams wore a hat that donned both the Mets and Yankees logos, as both teams are in the Major League Baseball playoffs. Adams was spotted wearing the hat in Manhattan on Monday while marching in a Columbus Day parade, and again yesterday at a press conference in Queens. Most New Yorkers want you to pick one or the other, Mets or Yankees, decide. Moving on, just weeks after turning 100 years old, former President Jimmy Carter has cast his ballot in the 2024 election. The Carter Center confirmed that the 39th President of the United States voted by mail earlier today. He told a family member his final wish was to live long enough to vote for Vice President Kamala Harris. Carter, who is the oldest living president, has been in hospice care, believe it or not, since February 2023. That does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.